In the Torah portion, we mentioned in the overview, we mentioned a mitzvah of putting a gate around the house as a safety precaution, and that's the commandment that we will focus on in tonight's class. Which brings us to this question, and that is, we find that many people of leadership position, great people, not just in leadership position, but people who are revered, respected, have fallen to great lows in various areas, in various secular leaders, Jewish leaders, religious leaders, some generations more, or those failings are known more, some generations less, but it's something that happens all too often, that we see that people in great positions seem to have tremendous failings, or there's some sort of scandal around the block. We're all too familiar with it when it comes to political campaigns, that there's always these constant smear campaigns that sometimes bring someone down all the way. How can it be that someone's so great? And we're not talking about someone who's just politically great, but someone who's inherently great. They're a good person, they're a great leader. How can it be that someone so great can fall to such great lows and do something so foolish? And so by examining this mitzvah, the mitzvah of placing a gate around our home, we will have some insight into this question, which will in turn, and more importantly, give us insight into applying these ideas to our personal life. And so we'll begin with text 1a. If you have the textbooks, it's on page 125. The quote from this week's Torah portion, the actual mitzvah of placing a gate. And the mitzvah reads as follows. When you build a new house, says the verse, you shall make a guardrail for your roof so that you shall not cause blood to be spilled in your house when the one who falls should fall from the roof. Very simple mitzvah. You got to put a gate. If there's a roof and people will be going on that roof, make sure you have a gate, because if not, God forbid, someone will fall off. As the verse continues and the commentaries explain, text 1b, so that you shall not cause blood to be spilled in your house. If someone were to fall, make sure that you are not in any way at fault, so that bloodshed not be attributed to your home. You can't say, look, I wasn't the one who told the guy to go up there. I wasn't the one who made him lose his balance or have an extra drink or two. You can't say that. If it's your home, you have to make sure it has the safety precautions in place, not just a Ring video camera and not just a great lock on the front door, but safety precautions for dangerous areas in the house. And the Talmud and the biblical commentators extend this to other areas of danger, that this law in the Torah is not just a law pertaining to specifically a roof, but really anything dangerous that may be in your home. You are biblically obligated to guard it properly, to put a safety on it properly. Medicine cabinet, a cabinet with chemicals. If you have a ditch on your property, you are biblically mandated to guard those areas properly to ensure that no one gets hurt. As is stated in the Code of Jewish Law, text 2, this law applies whether it is a roof or any dangerous thing liable to cause a fatal accident. For example, if someone has an empty pit in his courtyard, he must make a wall 10 tefachim tall around it. 10 tefachim is about 32 inches. Or to make a cover for it so that a person does not fall into it and die. This is the law. It's a very understandable law. It's a very important law, and some people forget about it. If you have a little porch, even if you don't use the porch, if there's a roof that people seldomly go up there, but sometimes people go there, there is an obligation to place a safeguard to ensure that no one gets hurt on your property. We're not going to discuss the mitzvah in general. We're going to highlight two specifics of this mitzvah. We're all familiar with blessings of a mitzvah. We put on tefillin, we make a blessing before putting on the tefillin. We light the Shabbos candles, we cover our eyes, and then we make the blessing, and then we uncover our eyes. Before we hear the shofar, there's a blessing. Before we read the Megillah, we light the menorah, there are blessings. And there are many, many blessings that we make excuse me, on the idea of doing a mitzvah. And this mitzvah of putting up a gate, putting a fence on the roof is no different. As the code of, as Maimonides says, when one makes a guardrail, the following blessing is recited while constructing it. Blessed are you, God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with your commandments and commanded us to construct a guardrail. And so we only make this blessing when putting a guardrail on a roof. If you're putting on an extra child lock on your medicine cabinet or on your household cleaners cabinet, or if you're covering up a pit, or if you're putting a fence around your pool, that's all the mitzvah. But the only time you actually make the blessing is if you're actually putting up a fence on a roof, the way it is biblically mandated, the way it says it in the verse. Other than that, we don't say the blessing. But the blessing itself is somewhat problematic. At first glance, it makes sense. You're doing a mitzvah, make a blessing. But the problem is that Maimonides himself says that there are certain commandments that we do not make a blessing. And the example that he gives, one of the things that he says, is that there is something that is done because of danger, then a blessing isn't stated. There are various other situations where we don't make a blessing, but this one is the most glaring. In the words of Maimonides, blessings are not recited over an obligation that was instituted because of danger. And this is not only somewhere else Maimonides writes that, in that same chapter where he says that we make this blessing on affixing a guardrail, 4 paragraphs earlier, he says we don't make a blessing on something that was instituted because of danger. So why do we say that the law is that we do make a blessing on putting up this guardrail if we don't make blessings on commandments that were instituted because of danger, which is the reason for the guardrail? Now, why don't we say commandments for obligations that were instituted for danger? There are various reasons. One reason, very simple reason, is because it's not something which is suitable for a blessing. A blessing is made on an act which is joyous, which is uplifting. That's when you make a blessing. You don't make a blessing on something which is there just for negative reasons. It's not why we make blessings. And so in a case of something that's there just for negative reasons, for something which is in danger, to prevent danger, it's for a negative reason, we don't make a blessing. But the question is there, why? Why does Maimonides say that we do make a blessing if just a few short paragraphs earlier he said we don't make a blessing on such commandments? Another odd thing about this commandment is the way the verse is phrased. What does the verse tell us? The verse that we quoted in the beginning of text 1a, we said that if someone, when you build a new house, hold on, only if it's a new house, if I'm building a new house, I buy a property, I buy a tear down, I pay 1.5 for a tear down here in Mar Vista, you go ahead, you knock it down, you build it, and then you're the one that's building it, and then you move into the house, and there's a roof that needs a gate. So then you're obligated to put up a guardrail. How about if it's not a new house? How about you bought a house that was an original, that was built in 1949, or you bought a house that's secondhand. Some developer built it and you moved into it. It's not a new house anymore. Someone else built it, or maybe someone lived in it for a year. All of a sudden, safety is not important. Only a new house, safety is important. How about an old house? Safety is not important. The Sifri, a very famous 12th century sage, commentary on the Torah, he explains as follows, that the verse is teaching us something important. New. It's highlighting the verse, the word new. Sorry, not a 12th century sage, a 3rd century sage. Sifri was authored by a 3rd century sage. New. Rebbe says that you must make a fence from when the house is made anew. In other words, when it's made new for you, when you move into the house, now it's new to you, that's when you have to make that fence. And the commentaries explain on this midrash, on this statement, that it's telling us that as soon as it becomes yours, even if you're not moving in yet, you're not going to move in for another 6 months because you have a contractor working on making various changes. You have a graphic designer or an internal design, interior designer, whatever it is, working on the house. You're not moving in yet, or your lease isn't up yet. You haven't sold your old house. You're still working out the move. You're not going to move into the house for a few months. Doesn't matter. Immediately, you have to place this gate, no questions asked. Immediately, you got to place this gate because the verse says new. In other words, right when it becomes new to you. And there is an important moral lesson here, which is we have to take responsibility for anything under our authority. In other words, here's the house. The person hasn't even moved into it yet. They may not be moving into it for another 3 months. But the verse tells us, and the law is that he must erect a fence around something which is dangerous, even though he's not there yet. He may have never even seen it yet. He still has that obligation to ensure that something dangerous under his eye isn't going to affect someone else. So we got to be careful when we do things, when we say things, or anything which may be perceived as something which is under our authority. Our properties, our possessions, should be careful to make sure the environment over which we may have some influence, we have to ensure that it's conducive for healthy and safe living. That being said, this still doesn't answer the idea, because if the Torah wanted to tell us, it doesn't answer the question. If the Torah wanted to tell us that one is obligated to put up the fence immediately, it could have said it in a very straightforward manner. Didn't have to use this phraseology of a new house, the phrasing of a new house. What is unique about a new house that the verse seems to imply that there's something important about a new house specifically over any other house? In order to understand these two questions, the first question of why do we make a blessing when Maimonides says something that's only for protection, something for something negative, we shouldn't make a blessing. And then he goes ahead and says we do make a blessing here. And the second blessing is, why does the Torah specifically refer to a new house? We have to look deeper at this law. Like we explained many times that the Torah is composed of many layers. Any story, any obligation, any teaching in the Torah can be taught and understood in a very basic level or on a deeper level. There are many layers to that deeper level. It's not that one negates the other, rather, there are multiple levels that are complementary each of each other. And so the Torah speaks about something physical, building a fence around a dangerous place in the house, a roof. But it's also speaking to the psychological, the social, the spiritual side of people and reality. And sometimes one mode of Torah interpretation is useful in resolving another mode of Torah interpretation, which is how we're going to approach these questions that we're asking today. You see, this mitzvah has profound spiritual significance. What is that? The idea that humans are vulnerable. Physically speaking, literally, humans are vulnerable. We're mortal. We can never take good health for granted, as this past year and a half, 2 years has shown us of all time. But it's also true spiritually, and perhaps even more so. No matter how much we have grown spiritually, no matter how much we've advanced, we always have the risk of falling spiritually. One should never be overly confident of their spiritual state. Like the Talmud tells us, text 5, do not be sure of yourself until the day you die. As Yochanan, the high priest, served in the high priesthood for 80 years and ultimately became a Sadducee, which was a heretic. So here he was, one of the greatest sages, one of the greatest leaders of the Jewish people. And after 80 years of being the high priest, which the mere fact that he was able to go into the Holy of Holies and come out alive every year proved that he was truthfully a great righteous Jew. But that all crumbled. History is filled with great men and women who stumbled at one point or another. And not just history, but Jewish history as well. And so the Talmud enjoins us to never feel overly confident about our spiritual highs, about ourselves. Why is that? How can it be that someone on such a great, lofty level, spiritual lofty level, can reach such a level? One of the central teachings, or perhaps the framework of the entire book, of the book of Tanya, the foundational work of Chabad Hasidus, is this idea that we live life with two souls. Every Jew possesses two souls, a godly soul and an animal soul, a natural soul and an animal soul. We've discussed it in the past, but I'm going to focus on one idea, and that is, because we have these two souls, it's entirely possible to make tremendous strides and have tremendous gains in one area, spiritually, reach tremendous lofty heights, but that doesn't mean that our second soul is gone. That doesn't mean that our animal soul is gone. The animal soul is still there. It's unaffected. Essentially, it's untouched. It's still there in its full power. And so just because one is on a roll with doing good things, just because one is on a roll with making all the right decisions, it doesn't mean that one's natural base tendencies or desires have changed or disappeared. And now that one can let their guard down. Not at all. What it does mean is that the impulses and desires are dormant. But if one isn't paying attention, in a heartbeat, it can come roaring back. And so a person must always remain vigilant and mindful of who's in charge. In the words of the Alter Rebbe, text 6, and this is a very powerful text, a very important text. It's from chapter 13 of the Tanya. Here's the words of the Alter Rebbe. Yet, inasmuch as the evil in the heart's left part of the Beinoni is the everyday man, remains with its innate strength. In other words, even if someone reaches tremendous spiritual heights, everything they do is good. Whenever they speak, it's kind and it's good and it's holy and it's special. They seem like they're the holiest person in the world. Nonetheless, even at that point, the evil in one's heart is still there. The animal soul is still there. And it's still craving after all the pleasures of this world. Therefore, one should not consider oneself immune, and should not accept the world's opinion, which would have him believe that the evil in him has been dissolved by the good, which is the rank of the tzaddik, the ultimate righteous person who has dissolved their evil side, but that's very, very rare. But the average person, even if they reach tremendous spiritual lofty heights, rather in his own estimation, he should consider himself as if the evil is at full strength in the left part as from birth, and that nothing of it has ceased or departed. On the contrary, with the passing of time, it has gained strength because the person has indulged it considerably in eating and drinking and other mundane pursuits. Everyone whose whole aspiration is in God's Torah, which he studies day and night for its own sake, this is still no even one whose whole aspiration is in God's Torah, which he studies day and night for its own sake. This is still no proof that the evil has been dislodged from its place. Rather, it may still be that its essence and substance are at full force. Could still be there. As a matter of fact, the Talmud tells us that one of the greatest sages, Rabbah, was convinced that he's just a Beinoni, that he's just at that everyday man level, that intermediate level. Because yes, he had reached such lofty heights. Yes, he was such a spiritual giant, but he still felt, hey, maybe I've never caused the full destruction of my evil side. Maybe it's just dormant. And it's just waiting for me to let my guard down to roar back. And his students weren't happy with his declaration of considering himself that middleman, that everyday man. His students were convinced that he's that ultimate, but he wasn't ready to let his guard down. Because no one can let their guard down. As the Alter Rebbe continues in Tanya and mentions this point of this great sage. But in an intermediate person, it is, by way of example, similar to a sleeping man who can awaken from his sleep. So is the evil in the intermediate person dormant, as it were, in the left part of the heart during the recital of the Shema and the prayer, when his heart is aglow with the love of God. But later, it can wake up again. For this reason, the great sage Rabbah considered himself as though he were a Beinoni. He was the intermediate. Though his mouth never ceased from study, and his desire was in God's Torah day and night, with the passionate craving and longing of a soul yearning for God with overwhelming love, such as experienced when reciting Shema and the Amidah. Hence, he appeared in his own eyes like an ordinary person who prays all day. So yes, a person may be really high on that spiritual ladder, but a person may never assume that they've attained spiritual immunity to testing situations. It doesn't mean that we're weak, God forbid. Not at all. That just means that we have these two souls, a two-soul outlook, if you will. On the one hand, we're powerful because we have the godly soul and we've worked on it and we've been reaching tremendous heights. But on the other hand, we're vulnerable because we have that animal soul in us. We're not weak. But what that does mean is that for most people, there's always that risk. There's that constant risk of failing. And so, yes, we absolutely should stand up to any test, to any challenge that comes, but we're aided from on high. And as a matter of fact, we say it in our daily prayers every single morning without fail, during the weekdays, during the Shabbos, during the holidays, every single morning. The first few pages of our prayers, we recite the following, the prayer of the Yehi Ratzon. And in the prayer, we say, bring us. We ask God to bring us not to sin, neither to transgression, nor a fall from grace. May we never a test have to face, nor ever come to disgrace. We should never face a test, we ask God. Yes, we know that tests come our way, challenges come our way. But even the most spiritual, lofty individual still says this prayer because their evil inclination, their animal soul is still there full force. It may be dormant like a person who's sleeping. But if one lets their guard down for a moment, who knows what's going to happen when it comes roaring back. And so it's important, says the Alter Rebbe in the Tanya, that we recognize our vulnerabilities. We recognize this point that we have this second soul that's ready to roar back at any moment. But the purpose is not just to deflate our ego and say, hey, we may be someone who reached such great heights. Don't get carried away with great heights because, hey, you got these vulnerabilities. It's not the point just to burst our egos. It's also for that. It's not to make us feel bad about ourselves, that we always have this evil inclination. Sometimes we give into it. It has very, very important implications. And that is the idea to put protective measures in our life. The purpose of an honest assessment of one's life is not to make one feel bad, is not to show someone how bad they are, to burst their bubble. The purpose of an honest assessment of oneself is to know what parts of life are more risk prone. And it's subjective. It's various areas, different things for other people. For some people, they need an extra barrier not to indulge in too much pizza. For other people, indulging in too much pizza is never an issue. but they need an extra barrier and not to sit in front of a television more than necessary. If necessary is an interesting word, but various social environments, unspiritual social environments. Some people need extra barriers for that area. And being that one may feel I'm holding on a such and such level, one may feel comfortable to let their guard down. And so we have to have these assessments, self-assessments and honest assessments to see, have an awareness of one's weaknesses, realize one's vulnerabilities in order to place those guardrails, those boundaries to enable one to have that step back to be safe, knowing which areas they're more risk prone. For example, if one has taken upon themselves to keep kosher, eat only kosher, and they drive past this drive-through boutique grill, which makes a mouth-watering Philly steak. And they want to stop by every day, and every day is a challenge. Instead of fighting that challenge every single day, put something ahead, put a protective measure, take a different route. Don't drive past that store. Don't drive past it. Instead of driving past it and having to put up your fight every single time, and think, hey, I'm strong enough, let's not get carried away with ourselves, because we have that evil inclination in us. It may be dormant, but at some point, if we're not fully focused, it may be let down. And in various areas of life, in short, we're affected by everything in life, psychologically and spiritually. Maybe something small, maybe something big, but we always have to have these prior assessments to put these protective measures in place. And so we have to identify which areas in our lives are off limits, which areas in our lives are out of bounds, and we have to put those protective measures in place. As the sages tell us, with regard to a nazir, an individual who's taken upon himself not to drink wine, which is a discussion for a different time, but suffice it to say, at this point, he's not allowed to drink wine. Our sages say that we tell a nazir, go around and do not approach the vineyard. Don't approach it. Don't get near it. Yes, it's going to be hard for you to drink that wine, so don't even tempt yourself. Right? People who go through AA, people who go through various types of gambling anonymous or whatever other anonymous one may be part of, takes a tremendous amount of thought on how not to fall into those traps again. And the sages take it a step further. In the words of Maimonides, according to rabbinic decree, it is forbidden for a nazir to abide amidst a gathering of people drinking wine. Instead, he should separate himself far from them because they present a hurdle for him. He shouldn't say, hey, I'm strong enough. I've worked hard enough. I went to AA meetings for 35 years, for 40 years. I'm strong enough. No, don't go there. It's a hurdle. Don't get yourself into these issues. You know, it's a hurdle for you. And so as the Tanya mentioned earlier, as we mentioned earlier from the Tanya, something that we've become accustomed to becomes harder to pull away from and much easier, much easier to slip right back, right? Old habits die hard. It's tough. And then even once you get over it, you can slip right back in. And that's why whenever we take resolutions, we got to be mindful of our previous behavior. And we have to know where is our personal risk zones. As the Alter Rebbe says, regarding an interesting statement in the Talmud, that when one passes a non-kosher restaurant, a person shouldn't say, ooh, it's disgusting, I never want to eat it. A person should say, no, it smells great, but what can I do? God said I'm not allowed to eat it. What's the point of that? The point of that is, we're not saying I don't eat it because I don't like the taste of it. Because then you're not doing it for God, you're not doing it for the mitzvah. You're saying, no, I would want to eat it, but I'm not eating it because God said. I'm not allowed to eat it. Says the Alter Rebbe, who could say that? That's only one who has never sinned in that sin. But say, for example, that cheeseburger, someone who has eaten cheeseburgers in their life, and now they've taken upon themselves tremendously to go ahead and eat only kosher. When they go back, they have to train themselves to be disgusted by that, because that's that extra boundary they're putting in place to ensure that they won't slip up. Text 9. Tshuvat hageder, the tshuva of the fence, means distancing from evil to the greatest degree possible so that one will not be tempted to sin, God forbid. The penitent needs this more than someone who has not sinned. The sages taught one should not say, I am repulsed by the thought of eating meat and milk. Rather, what should he say? I am not repulsed, but what can I do? My Father in heaven has decreed upon me that we're not allowed to eat it. The holy Maggid said that this only applies to someone who has never sinned. The penitent, however, must develop a feeling of disgust toward evil or that which is forbidden, so that he says this is repulsive to me, so that he does not fall into it. Thus, someone who has been in a lower place must be extra careful even after he has come up. And so ultimately, this idea of imposing limits upon ourselves is about humility. It takes humility to recognize the need for borders and protective measures. Why? Because borders and protective measures reflect on one's shortcomings. And it has a psychological impact. When someone is carefree about their limits and about their boundaries, it can eventually convince them of their invincibility, about living within them, and about their invincibility, about letting their guard down, and then failing. Whereas setting limits, living within limits, in turn, it has a humbling effect because it reminds us of our own limits. The many cautions and barriers and limitations placed in Judaism serve this purpose, reminding us that after all, we're human beings of flesh and blood. We have temptations, we have impulses, and we have to curb them. And it takes humility to internalize that. And now we can turn back to our Torah portion. When we read that verse, the verse of the law of putting the fence, on a spiritual level, we now understand that the verse isn't just talking about houses of brick and mortar. It's talking about us. Each human being is a house. In a way, every human being is a house because we have souls, our consciousness, our minds, our hearts, our emotional attributes are all housed in our body. So we're all individual houses. In the words of the Rebbe, sometimes house can refer to a person's body. Sometimes when the verse says house, it's not referring to a literal house of brick and mortar. It's referring to a person's body. And so when the godly soul comes into the body, not for its own sake, what's the purpose of it coming down into the body, the divine soul? But for the body and the part of the world that it's there to refine, to elevate, and to make more spiritual. And so what does the house symbolize? The house symbolizes the aspects of ourselves that we're supposed to work with to elevate it. And so we're going to take this metaphor further. What's the roof of the house? The roof of the house is the ultimate, the highest point of a person. What's the highest point of the house, of the aspect of the person that has to be worked on? Person's ego. The ego reaches really high. Person's arrogance, his ego, his haughtiness can reach really, really high, right? The roof. So what does the verse tell us? We got to place a boundary around the roof. So someone shouldn't fall off the edge of the roof. Someone shouldn't fall off the edge of their ego. Because of their ego, they're not able to implement these boundaries, these limitations. They're going to fall off that edge of the ego. And God forbid they will fail. They would fall deeply into something, a spiritual abyss. We ought to have that boundary or the knowledge to implement those boundaries, which is the humility. So the Torah tells us that excessive pride, excessive arrogance, self-absorption, complacency, these are all things that are attached to our egos without limitations and boundaries. And the Torah cautions us, we got to place boundaries on the edges of the roof, boundaries around our weaknesses. We have to put a cap on that ego. We have to be aware of our weaknesses and our flaws, not to have it get us down, not to have it make us feel bad about ourselves, but rather to caution us where we ought to place these boundaries. In the words of the Shalah, beautiful passage from the 16th century sage Rabbi Yeshayahu Alevi Horowitz. And he says as follows. The verse says, and you shall make a guardrail for your roof. I have found an allusion here. Since the roof is tall, the Torah is alluding to the notion that one should impose limits on his haughtiness. If not, then that will be his downfall. For the one who falls will fall from it. As it stated, before destruction comes pride, and before stumbling, a haughty spirit. And you shall make the Maggid, explains further, and you shall make a guardrail for your roof. According to the literal reading, it should have said, and you shall make a guardrail for its roof. It's not your roof, it's the house's roof, its roof, referring to the house that was built. The meaning then is this, make a guardrail for your roof. That is to say, a boundary on your roof, namely on your greatness, that your heart should not be too haughty. So the mitzvah of making a maikah, making a gate around one's house, is about making limits, boundaries specifically on one's ego. It's not only for boundaries on the balcony, gates covering surrounding the pool, putting locks on medicine chests. That's not what it's about. It's not only that, obviously it's that. That's the literal, that's the mitzvah. But it's also about making limits on our egos. And the Torah is warning us that we have to make and take appropriate precautions to stay humble, to maintain perspective, and to avoid ever becoming convinced of our invincibility or superiority. That's what this mitzvah is about. Which leads us to a very important point, and that is this idea that we ought to have humility. And up until now, the idea of having humility has been with the presumption that humility is a form of restraint, right? To make sure that it's not something negative that's happening. But the reality is it's only part of the story. It's only one aspect of the humility that we have. What's the other aspect of it? The other aspect of having humility is the idea of what humility accomplishes for us. The Hasidic masters explain that true humility helps us grow. Not just helps us as a boundary, as a restraint from doing things that we shouldn't do, but it actually helps us grow tremendously. Let's think about it for a minute. Each person has boundaries, not boundaries that we've placed on ourselves, but boundaries that naturally come, natural limitations that we're each born with. When we discover, when we work up, when we come against, when we struggle with these limitations that we all have, we realize that these limits are part of life. This is who we are. We endeavor to remedy our shortcomings, to overcome our weaknesses, and we should, as much as we can. But sometimes we come up these personal challenges that we think we can't solve them. They're limitations that are beyond us. We've tried everything. We've read piles upon piles of self-help books. We've spoken to 10 different psychologists. We've reached the max. We've even listened to 15 YouTube videos on it. And we can't seem to get over this personal boundary that we have. It seems that it's something that we'll never be able to fix. And then we come to the recognition that some of these limits are just part of our life. Take, for example, one limitation that every person has: mortality. It's a limitation. Everyone has it. Yeah, there are some people who would like to believe that they're immortal, but mortality is something that we all have. It's a limitation that no matter how many self-help books, we can't overcome it. What happens when we recognize these shortcomings, when we recognize these limitations, these boundaries that we may have? We can become depressed. We can become down. We can fall into despair, give up and say, you know what, I'm done. I can't overcome it. But what do you do when we hit a dead end? In any challenge, not something as magnificent as mortality, even something a little bit, a small challenge, we turn to God. Not because there's no atheists and foxholes and we've reached the point of no return and we've reached the dead end. And so I'm in a foxhole, I'm going to turn to God. No, not because of that. The idea of coming to God when we reach these limits is the idea that recognizing God is our creator. He's the one who placed these limits, who created these limits, who gave us these limitations in the first place. And what's the purpose when we recognize these limitations? When we recognize these limitations, these boundaries that we have, if we stop and we think about God who gave us these limitations, it enables us to recognize this idea that we should never make a mistake and think that the buck stops here. It's all about me. There's something greater than me, says the limitation. Says the boundary tells us there's something greater. There's something beyond me. When we steer at our own deficiencies, when we steer at our own limitations in the face, we're forced to admit that there's something greater than us. There's something beyond us that created these limitations. In the words of the Rebbe, so that no creature, why did God create these limitations? So that no creature will ever make the mistake of thinking that they have no need for the creator and the ruler of the world. To that which is higher than them, God created them with a deficiency in their being, one that they cannot fill themselves. And as a result, they sense that they are dependent on a higher power. If God is perfect, why didn't he create a perfect world with perfect beings? And the answer is so that we will recognize God. Imagine we had no limitations, no boundaries, no deficiencies. Everything was perfect. We'd forget about God. Who's God anyhow? What do I need him for? It reminds me of the story. This guy's looking for a parking spot. And he turns to God and he says, God, look, if you help me find a parking spot, I'm going to go to synagogue for the next 4 weeks. And he's looking and he's circling and it's at Westfield Mall, and he's looking at those signs, and the signs say there's 386 spots available on level 4, and he goes to level 4 and they're all taken. There's nothing, and he's circling and he's giving up, and he says, God, look, you know what? Here's the deal. If you find me a parking spot, I'm going to put on tefillin every single day. And as he's finishing that, a car pulls out right in front of him, and he turns to God and he says, God, you know what? Forget about it. I found the parking space by myself. When we have limitations, when we have something amiss, we suddenly recognize there's a God. We recognize, it enables us to recognize that there's a God. And so that's why God put holes in our being. That's why God put these bumps and creases in the world and in our lives. They make us stop and think and search for answers. And eventually they make us look up at God. And so the idea is not something which is flawed, something which is negative. On the opposite side, the idea of these bumps and creases in life, it's something positive. because it serves a tremendous positive purpose. It's a window to God. This is a kind of healthy humility that's integral with any relationship, especially with our relationship with God. Being humble lets us create a relationship, a connection outside of ourselves, enabling us to build a better life, especially with our relationship with God. It enables us to recognize something outside of us. If we don't have this humility, we're limited in our connection to something outside of us, especially God. When we have this humility to recognize our weaknesses, to recognize our limitations, to recognize our challenges, the bumps and creases in our lives, internally, externally, when we recognize it, we're now able to reach for something beyond us, to reach for a relationship and a connection with God. And so humility is not merely a restraint to hold us back from doing something negative. On the contrary, it's something tremendous that enables us to reach to the greatest heights ever. This is how growth occurs, right? A scientist can't make tremendous scientific discoveries unless he or she is capable of looking past their old theories, looking past their observations, and surrendering themselves to new possibilities. If not, they'll never reach new possibilities. Doctors, professors, innovators, whatever it may be, the only way they can have true growth is through humility. The vehicle for any kind of innovation is bittul, self-nullification. When one wishes humility, when one wishes to make a leap to a place that is incomparably greater than his previous station, he must first reach a state of loss and nothingness. Through this, one becomes a vessel for achieving that ascent. And that's why the Torah uses the term a new house. A new house over here, we're not saying a house. We're saying any endeavor, any step in life, any new journey, every day is a new journey. Every time we approach something new, a new day, a new era, a new job, a new whatever it is, let's place that boundary. Let's recognize which areas are more risk prone. Let's recognize where we need that. We have to have that humility to recognize our weaknesses in that new day, in that new hour, in that new job, in that new aspect of life. And then we're able to build a proper home. Which takes us to our second question, which we asked first, and that was, why make a blessing? Maimonides says something which is there for danger, we don't make a blessing. And a gate is there for withholding something negative from about to happen. But now that we understand it in its deeper sense, placing a gate isn't there just to hold something back from negative happening. Placing that boundary enables us to reach heights that we never knew we can reach. And so that's why we make a blessing, because having that humility to go ahead and have that personal assessment, an honest assessment to see where we may have weaknesses, to see where we may be risk prone, and to place the boundaries there that enables us. It's not something from holding us back from falling. It is, but not only that, it enables us to have exponential growth beyond what we would have dreamed possible.